Friends, allies, and Americans, welcome to the Defense of Democracy podcast, where we tell the stories of folks who defend your children's rights by advocating for inclusive public school systems and who fight for diversity across our nation. I'm your host, Karen Swoboda. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Defense of Democracy podcast. My guest today is Jennifer De La Jara. She is a fundraising expert and also a former school board member for one of the largest school districts in the country, Charlotte-Mecklenburg School District. And so, Jennifer, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So I would love if you could share with our listeners some of your background and experience as a board member, as a mom, just living in North Carolina and dealing with what's been happening in the school system.
Yeah, certainly. So I have an 18 and 16-year-old currently. When I first ran for the Board of Education back in 2019, I guess that was, 6 years ago. So they were a bit younger and both in middle school at the time. So one is graduated and I still have a junior in high school. So really, they've always been in public school, just right in the thick of it. Very proud to have served a 4-year term on our local Board of Education, which so happens to be, I think we're the 17th largest school district in the nation. It's a very diverse school district in all ways, racially, ethnically, low income, high income, middle income, mostly urban, but also some suburban. We basically don't have any rural area left in the greater Mecklenburg area, the greater Charlotte area, but a very diverse and vibrant school district. And I ran for an at-large seat back in 2019. We have 6 districts and 3 at-large, and I was they alternate their 4-year terms. Was elected to that seat, sworn in December of 2019, and 3 months exactly to the date of my swearing in. Was March 13th that the governor of North Carolina effectively, shut down the schools in response to COVID. So a real fire hose, as they say, drinking from the fire hose. You're coming on as a new school board member, and then on top of learning everything else, I certainly had a lot of knowledge, obviously, about education. I also had worked in parallel in conjunction, working a lot with our immigrant community here in Charlotte. I was an ESL instructor for our local community college and had been in the schools working with parents, immigrant parents, at 6 or 7 schools across the county. So I had a lot of knowledge about the schools and about government and my own experience as a parent, but coming in as a board member, learning everything, and then on top of it, everything just turned upside down, literally overnight, and experiencing it both as a parent, having 2 middle schoolers at home, not sure what the rest of the school year would look like, and then effectively having what I call public health sort of dumped in our lap, locally, because it was like, who's in charge and who's making these decisions. And obviously, at the time we'd hear about the CDC, but there was the local, in our case, Mecklenburg County, Board of Health. The governor, was having daily press conferences, and then we're trying to respond to what are we going to do and how are we going to still provide education. So it was a real introduction coming in, and then going back in a virtual environment, went through that whole shebang. And honestly, coming back into the schools was then a little bit more difficult than even being virtual, because the students really struggled. That second year of COVID, the students struggled a lot. So I say all that to say, I guess I had a more typical board experience the last 2 years of my 4-year term. The first 2 years was very atypical, and it was a very stressful time for sure. But what an honor to be able to sit in that seat during COVID and experience that and be a decision maker at the time. So I learned a lot, and it certainly, I think, ties into that COVID period to some of the things that we're going to talk about today, because that's when I first started to see some of the anti-institutional, rhetoric pop up.
And I definitely want to talk about that, because I think it can't be understated, the impact that COVID had on our on our schools, but on kind of on our school reputation, the reputations, after that of all of our public institutions. But I'm always curious, why did you decide to step up and join your school board at that time?
For two reasons. One, I had been, actively involved in community building work and in the schools, as I said, working with the immigrant communities in
Mhm.
particular, and was an educator, by trade. And I had been speaking out, with various concerns of, the state of, immigrants, in our community. And a friend of mine, actually, who was very involved, in politics and other community building work, she suggested to me, you should consider running for office. And of course, the typical, they say it takes 5 to 7 times for any particularly female candidates to agree to that.
Mhm.
So, I remember the first time she asked, a couple of other people asked, I sort of laughed, thought that was funny. And then eventually it was sort of like, well, maybe the universe is trying to tell me something. Maybe I should run. And so when the time came and the position seemed right, it made sense that I serve on the school board because I, one as a parent, two had the intimate relationships, working with in various schools. It just made a lot of sense to jump in, and so yeah, I went for it, and it was an interesting ride.
Yeah, I'll bet. So let's get into COVID and really talk about, because we do mention it on the show, but I feel like it's something that, you know, I still feel like most people don't get. Can you kind of, in your experience and what you experienced, talk about how COVID affected, your public school, the perception of what a public school is in general in your area?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for speaking about it, because sometimes I feel like people want to sort of just move on and act like it didn't happen,
Yep.
or maybe think, well, it wasn't that big of a deal as far as the severity. And what we were hearing from public health officials is that there were so many unknowns. And
Mhm.
obviously, we were watching what was happening in New York and other places, and it may not have seemed as severe, but the spread was really, really high here in our area as well, from the get go. What was interesting about that time for me, we got a lot of emails, and I started to really pay attention to human behavior, human response. And I sort of characterize it as I got to see it all. I got to see the good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly
Yeah.
of human, just response. And a lot of it, I think, was dictated sometimes around political ideologies or beliefs around rights, individual rights, and things like that, which I'll get to in just a moment, but also around um, just the interpretation. It was sort of interesting because I would get a lot of mail saying things like, Dr. Fauci said, and in fact, he did say this, and I'm sure I don't have the quote exactly right. Yes, it's better for children to be back in school, comma, when community spread levels are low. That was effectively the quote. Okay, so if you were of the mindset that it was better for children to be back in school, you would send me that article and say, "See, Dr. Fauci says it's better for children to be back in school," and leave off the comma when community spread levels are low. If you were of the mindset, not one single person can die from this, and community levels are, super, super high, super, super red, don't you dare go back to in-person instruction, then you would focus on the latter part of that. And both sides, if you will, were sending me the same articles as evidence to confirm their point of view. And just depending on which side, so that became really challenging because, it's like, how do you,
I mean,
there,
it really is. It's like, I don't know what that version of selective hearing is, right? Like you're
right.
picking and choosing the parts of that information that you fit your narrative.
Yes.
So,
And in part, maybe that worked with what was going on in your life at the time. I think that was a big factor. For me, I had two middle schoolers at the time. They were relatively technologically adept. They could pretty much do it, the online learning. But, I really felt the most sympathy for the ones that had kindergartners and first graders and second graders, because here they were now being forced themselves, if they were so lucky, to work from home and not have to be, a healthcare worker themselves or some other essential worker. But now they're having to teach their children or be there right beside them to help them with the technology. So I think a lot more of the angst came from that, and the reaction the parents themselves were feeling. And so what was really challenging is that sometimes people would get very fiery in their response, and it would say things like, if you don't get kids back into school, they're going to have depression and a child's going to commit suicide and blood will be on your hands. And at the same time, I was getting emails saying, don't you dare go back to school, because even if little Susie doesn't get it, she's going to bring it home to grandma and grandma's going to die and blood will be on
oh
your
my
hands.
God.
And it was
Mhm.
that sort of that much passion,
Yeah.
in it. And so it was a really, hard time. And then of
Mhm.
course we had, our educators to think about. So yes, while there was some initial evidence that children weren't necessarily dying from it
Mhm.
at the rate
Mhm.
that the adults were, you we knew they were spreading. We absolutely
Mhm.
knew they were spreading it, and so our educators were concerned, grandparents were concerned,
Mhm.
a lot of people were very concerned, and so it was that heightened sense of, what do you do? And at the end of the day, you had to make a decision, and that meant by default, because there was no meeting of the middle ground. You were
Right.
either in person or you weren't. And so one group was going to be, disappointed for sure.
And just, and I totally agree with you in that, I think at that moment in time, people were very much in their own bubbles because they were literally in their own bubbles. You were not interacting with other people in a normal way. And for my family, our bubble was that we have a child who has a chronic lung issue, and that her doctor had
Yep.
told me if she gets this, she just said, "Don't let her get it." But I knew that she was really, really concerned. And my child was a freshman at the time in high school. And I remember going onto like social media, onto the local parents Facebook group, and they were all like, with the, we need to open the schools. And I was naive at that time, right? I was like, oh, you know what? They don't get it because their kids don't have health issues or chronic health issues. So let me like educate them. And I wasn't being aggressive or obnoxious at all. I was just like, listen, I just want to tell you that there's another perspective to this. And of course, because of her health issues, I was also recognizing about the teachers too, but I was really looking at it through the eyes of a parent with a sick child. And I put it on there, and the response from these particular women was, yeah, I agree. It sounds like it would be dangerous. You should keep her home. So, I mean, there was a hard line between us and them. There
Yeah.
wasn't going to be like, oh, I didn't think of that light bulb. My
Yeah.
child can maybe wear a mask or, whatever. It was like all or nothing. So it was an
Mhm.
ugly time.
And that played out even when we went back to in person learning, but we were wearing masks
Hmm.
because, and this sort of gets to when I started to see how people's different interpretations of this and some of the anti school rhetoric, because then the emails I started getting, what started bubbling up for the folks that, wanted to be back in person, and then for some of them, not have their children wear a mask. And so the messaging I was getting was, this is against my American rights. You can't muzzle our children. This is child abuse. You are muzzling our children, which I thought was a very, sort of stark
Yeah.
representation of what, for someone like your family, you're going back. Of course you wanted other children to mask, and there was a lot of, also, we're a really large county, that which I mentioned,
Mhm.
so there might be there's seven municipalities total, Charlotte being the large city, but other small towns. So sometimes people were looking at the data at that level and they're like, well, I live in town X, our levels aren't that high or low, whatever. Could we go back to school? And not really seeing that we're all interconnected. And just because you're in that particular town doesn't mean that the teachers don't live in Charlotte, where maybe the spread was worse, or even outside of the county, which we weren't necessarily looking at. So it was really interesting to see how people wanted to isolate and not necessarily were making the connections that we are all interconnected, and that we might, for the sake of public health and each
Mhm.
other, maybe the better choice is that we do just stay home, let those
Well,
levels go down, wear masks, and put public health first.
and
Um,
it reminds me here in New York, and this is another example, but here in New York, we have a situation when it snows, right? When it snows, the school may close. And, you'll go on social media and you'll see some people posting and saying, like, why did the school close? There's a dusting on my street. I can get out, I'm driving around. And then other people on the other side of town are like, no, we got like 2 feet here, so, and it's the whole school. So you cannot you cannot do it street by street. So now we're about the halfway point for the podcast, and I normally do a volunteer shout out, but I'm going to do something a little different today. You are from North Carolina, and while I have some amazing, wonderful volunteers in North Carolina who all deserve a shout out, I want to put a message out there for volunteer we're looking for. So Defense of Democracy is actually looking for a volunteer state director. We have 14 volunteer state directors in different states all around the country. They volunteer about 4 hours a week. It's completely remote, but they help mobilize their state and connect with other organizations and protect their public schools. So if you are thinking that you might be a right fit to join as a volunteer state director in North Carolina, we are looking for you. All you need to do is text the word volunteer to 845-208-9846, and I will happily connect you with our volunteer coordinator and get you set up. So please consider that. Okay, now, Jennifer, back to you. So let's talk about what's going on right now, present day. Let's talk about what came out of COVID, and has there been at a state level, like legislation that's been passed or proposed that might affect the public school system, now that we have kind of the fallout from COVID and everything that has happened?
Yeah, great question. So when I was on the school board and we saw that, and the Don't Muzzle Our Children movement, let's call that, I think that sort of morphed into the folks that were showing up and were the anti-CRT crowd. And effectively, they were the same crowd, critical race theory. Being on the school board, it was a really interesting thing to watch because, of course, we knew we weren't teaching CRT. We'd like to think of ourselves as high flyers, but we weren't teaching, college level, courses in the school system. But just a lot of angry people showing up. It's not on the agenda. Typically, people speak to things that are on the agenda, right? So you saw a lot of folks showing up at school board meetings talking about CRT, which is something we clearly weren't doing. And then that sort of morphed into, anti DEI, anti-social and emotional learning, because they had tied that to DEI. And then, of course, book banning and anti-LGBTQ language. A lot of, hate speech coming from people speaking at the dais. And just to be clear, it may not sound directly hateful, like slurs and things being used, but in my opinion, where people are showing up at the dais and they're equating, being gay or non-binary to a mental illness,
Yeah.
that effectively is hate speech. And I say that because our chair would gavel out any direct hate speech, but it was interesting the way that you could tell people had been coached
Oh,
with certain
yeah.
speeches, to be able to give.
Just as an
And
aside, I will say that I have seen speeches given in Florida that are almost identical to speeches given in Kansas. So
yes,
they are providing them with these remarks.
yes, these can exactly. And
Mm.
so, from that, then we also had, you asked about legislation. So yes, we did have legislation passed that was, sort of in line with the Parental Rights Act, that are bills that you would see passed in Florida and other states. We had that pass here as well. And, there was a lot of social media activity around that. Like, we're getting this passed. This is such a great thing. But of course, the reality is that the legislation they passed in our General Assembly basically just outlined rights that parents had anyway. And so that was really interesting because there was this, we're finally going to be able to have access to our kids, grades. And it's like, well, you already do have that. We're finally going to have access to this. So there was a lot of.
We're finally going to have a day where we can go in and meet our teachers at the beginning of the year.
Yeah. So, I mean, but, look, in politics, narrative is the
Yes.
half the battle, if not the entire battle, right? Narrative wins. And so
Yeah.
there was a lot of celebration. I think it's a way to pull in parents to almost let them believe that you didn't have these rights and now you do. I mean, even access to records around, like, if a child had requested a pronoun name change or something like that, like, you by FERPA as a parent have federally protected rights. And so people were taking victory laps on how they had made all of this happen, and effectively there wasn't that much, with the exception of, yes, now teachers, or administrative staff would have to report back to the parents if there's any talk of questioning, sexuality or gender, and then a process for evaluating books, and which ones would need to be excluded, etc. So what's interesting about that is, that gets passed, and we in North Carolina, and this may be different across the nation. In fact, I think there's only about 13, maybe 16 states that are called Dillon's Rule states. And what that means is that our state legislature has a lot of power. And we, as local government, city councils, county commission, and school boards, effectively don't have any power that's not explicitly granted. And the opposite of that would be local control, where you do have a lot of local control. We have to sort of comply with the state legislature. And so when they passed that legislation, then it was put on the 115 school districts across the state of North Carolina to adopt those policies in order to be compliant with the law. And so there were members of organizations in the chamber that day, and I spoke to them and I said, you show up with your shirt on that reads, "We do not co-parent with the government," but yet when it suits you, you actually go straight to big government, right? So the idea is, well, we don't like big government. We want less government. We want less government. But isn't it interesting that when you want something pushed through to force other people to comply to what your book preferences are, then you go straight to the government and use big government. So I always reject this idea that, sort of conservative ideals around less government, because I find that oftentimes, whether that's making decisions on who we marry, or, what kind of books we read and all of these sort of things, people are very much about big government, and they want government to set boundaries on what the rest of us can do.
And it boggles the mind, because when you go in as an individual, first of all, most schools, almost everyone I've talked to, there is a process to opt your child out of
100%.
books and topics. Okay.
Yeah.
So you have the right to do that. When you go into school and ban a book, you're taking away all of the other parents' rights to say, I want my children to learn this. Right. So it is, the parents' rights movement is the parents' rights for the majority of the parents, and not a small subset of really loud bullies in that community to make those decisions. And and again, this is more anecdotal, but I'll tell you who I see going in there and banning the books are the parents who maybe haven't had their voice, it's mostly like, I have a platform now, I can be listened to, I'm important, I'm bragging because I got 500 books banned for all the children in my school district. So
yeah, I agree. I mean, I think a lot of people get into activist mode and they feel like they're doing something and find
right.
some value in feeling like they are, moving some narrative forward. But, and I do think that some people, feel very passionately, like, that could be their religious belief or whatever, that they don't want, a sexual scene in a book, at a high school level or something like that. The other side to that is, children need to be informed that these things happen and have knowledge around how to protect themselves from vulnerable situations, or how to say no and exercise their agency. So I'm not sure if acting like teenagers don't engage with this is the best way, when you could also empower them with the knowledge, and help them to
And
be
let's
able to
talk
say
about
no.
the fact that every child, every teenage child, and most middle and elementary school kids have access to the internet. So if
Yeah,
you're
and
telling
even if not
yourself,
also, some of them would say, "Well, I don't give my kids access." So again, that's your right. So that's the beauty of choice, because you
right.
can choose that, just like you could opt out of any book. Those that was always an option before the parental rights bill.
Well,
What
it's an okay.
happened now, if I can just say this one piece,
Yeah, yeah.
is because they didn't think through what the secondary impacts would be, and so they forced all parents to opt in
Hmm.
to everything. And so, many parents, for multiple reasons, including myself, I get 100 emails a day. I don't read
Hmm.
everything coming. Some parents are working 3 jobs. So we've actually, and I've been off the board now for a little over a year, but when I went off the board, we're not able to do dental screenings and vision screenings and things like this that are really important, because we're not able to get all the parents to comply, because they're busy, and so
Hmm.
I don't even want to fault them for that. It's like we weren't thinking through, and because the way it was written as a health bill, anything that related to health, you know. They had to opt in instead of opt out. And so
Wow.
there are lots of secondary, effects to that,
Wow.
unfortunately.
Yeah, well, what I was going to say is, going back to the whole internet and books thing, I was one of those parents who my kids, I was fairly strict about electronics across the board. We didn't even have a TV until
Mhm.
they were in elementary school, and certainly with the phones and internet access, I was a hard line on that. But I also wasn't kidding myself that just because they didn't have a phone, that they weren't going to have a friend with a phone, right? So
Or in
there
the
is
bathroom,
there
exactly.
I
Mhm.
mean, I did it when I was
Yeah,
when I was a kid. Like my
yeah,
friend would bring, a magazine and be like, "Oh my God," like, and everybody would see it. So
right.
you were a child too, and you know that
Mhm.
happens. And so that's the parent's decision. If you don't want to prepare your kid for that, and it sucks because I didn't want to prepare my child for the violence on the
Right.
internet and the sexual content on the internet, that's the world we live in.
Yeah.
That's the
And
reality. The books, I was not worried. God, if they're reading a book, it means they're not on the internet. So good.
exactly. Well, and so, for different parents, it was different touch points of where these things would bother them. But
Mm,
I think what many of them maybe even were missing, and I think this gets to, the topic of the defense of democracy, is how does this relate to democracy? Is, when they would come in with the shirt that reads, we do not co-parent with the government, like my biggest concern was always that message, because,
mm-hmm.
it's not just what you're effectively saying is government is bad. We don't trust government. You can't trust government. And at the end of the day, public education is a function of government. We met in the government center to hold our public meetings just like any other
Yeah.
government and duly elected body, would do. And so you're sending this message that is destroying those pillars of our democracy, pillars
Mm,
of our society, by constantly sending messaging that govern. And at one point, President Trump, from the State of the Union speech, actually said, the horrible government schools, like that sort of language is
yes.
used on purpose. The
Yeah.
government schools, to communicate this sense that you can't trust it. And that's a deeper concern I have still today, as
Same.
this carries on. These themes in our nation of when you can't trust anything, um, then what are people looking to, where they
Right.
find stability? And I would say, actually, with the level which our schools are intertwined in our communities, you've got your great principals and instructional leaders and teachers, and yes, the school librarian. I mean, these are people we should and can trust. And I find that very sad. So I am appreciative of groups like yours that are showing up to say, we do trust and we want to continue to work together because you in our communities, because you recognize the value that the public school
Yeah.
provides.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining the podcast. I always like to end on a happy note. So I was hoping you could maybe share something that you're looking forward to in the coming months.
Oh, something that I am looking forward to. I I think we just elected here in North Carolina a new state superintendent of public instruction. Not every state has that role, so it may
Right.
not resonate with everyone. But people came together in part because the opposing candidate was very much, in fact, she was actively telling people to pull their children out of public schools because you couldn't trust them,
Oh my
which we
God.
found really interesting, given that she was vying, to run,
Oh, wow.
the state school system, and uh, 2.5 million children, I think, in it, and oversee that in an $11 billion budget. But she lost, and the candidate, who's a real public school supporter and understands the value that it places in community, his name is Mo Green. He was just sworn in January, so I think that is a good note to know that I can look forward to having a true professional who understands the value of educators, who wants to lift them up in our community and understands the value of an excellent public school system. So striving for that.
I love that. And I think that there are still people out there who are running for office for the right reasons. They're running to support the institutions that they're running to support and to advocate for. So really glad to hear some good news on your end, and hopefully this is indicative of maybe a turning tide. Fingers crossed, knock on wood, all that. But I've remained hopeful. I wouldn't be able to do this job if I didn't have hope that the best of us would eventually shine through. So Jennifer, again, thank you for joining the podcast. I look forward to working with you and hearing more good things from you in the weeks ahead.
Thank you so much.